I've always believed that music has a way of revealing the truths we try to bury. The tempo of a voice, the dissonance of a sigh, even the pauses between words. These things, like notes on a page, can be read if you know how to listen. And lately my wife, Elena, has been out of tune. It started with the late nights. At first, she explained them away. Rehearsals are running over, or I'm working on a solo piece. It made sense. After all, we were both musicians. I knew the demands of her craft because they mirrored my own. But then, there were the little things. She began to miss notes during practice sessions. Her fingers, once fluid and sure, stumbled. And when I asked her about it, she laughed it off, her smile a little too quick, her voice just a touch too high. The changes were subtle but impossible to ignore. She stopped asking me to review her compositions, a ritual we'd shared for years. She started locking her phone, something she'd never bothered with before. One night, as she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A name I didn't recognize flashed on the screen. Gabriel. Gabriel. I picked up the phone but stopped myself before opening it. I set it back down, my hand trembling. Confrontation would come later. First, I needed to understand. I became hyper-aware of her every move after that. The way her lips pressed together when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her eyes flicked away when I tried to meet them. The absence of her scent on our sheets. And then there was the music. Elena had always written me pieces, small, intimate compositions for my ears alone. But her latest piece felt different. It was beautiful, yes, but hauntingly so. It had an unfamiliar melody woven through it, something foreign to her usual style, something that didn't belong. I sat at the piano one night, tracing the notes with my fingers, and I found it. A sequence that felt out of place. It repeated in strange intervals, like a secret trying to whisper itself into existence. That's when I realized. The notes weren't just notes. They were a code. The discovery chilled me to my core. If this was a message, who was it meant for? I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stared at the piano, the weight of my realization sinking in. Elena was hiding something, and whatever it was buried in her music. That night, as she lay beside me in bed, her breathing slow and steady, I promised myself one thing. I would find out the truth. And when I did, I would make her and her lover pay for every single note of their betrayal. The symphony had only begun, and I was already composing the final movement. The following day, I couldn't shake the thought of that coded melody. It gnawed at me like a splinter buried deep under my skin. The dissonant intervals, the peculiar repetition, they were deliberate. Music is never accidental, not when composed by someone like Elena. I spent hours at my piano, deconstructing her piece note by note. My mind was a chaotic symphony of suspicion, and my fingers worked feverishly as if decoding her secrets would quiet the storm. Then I saw it, a pattern hidden within the notes. It wasn't just music. It was a cipher. The notes corresponded to letters, Gabriel. My stomach churned, and I slammed the lid of the piano shut. Gabriel wasn't just a name on her phone. He was embedded in her music, immortalized in her creation. A lover's mark, hidden in plain sight. I leaned back in my chair, the room suffocatingly silent. My thoughts raced. How long had this been going on? How deep did her betrayal run? Elena, my Elena, who once claimed I was her muse, had given her art, our art, to someone else. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable. So I began to watch her more closely. Every interaction, every gesture. I became a shadow in my own home, quiet and observant. I scrolled through our shared calendar, cross-referencing her rehearsals with the orchestra's official schedule. I even called her colleagues under the guise of confirming performance dates. And that's when I discovered the second lie. She wasn't rehearsing with the orchestra on Thursday nights as she claimed. They didn't even have sessions scheduled. Where was she really going? That night, I made a decision. I kissed her goodbye as she left for her rehearsal. My face calm, my voice even. But instead of returning to my work, I grabbed my coat and followed her. She didn't go to the concert hall. She didn't even stay in the city. I trailed her car through the winding streets until she reached a dimly lit hotel on the outskirts of town. My chest tightened as I watched her park, step out, and disappear inside. Not even 10 minutes later, another car pulled up. Gabriel. I recognized him instantly, the arrogant conductor who strutted through rehearsals like a self-proclaimed genius. He followed her inside, his hand casually adjusting his tie as though preparing for something far more intimate than a meeting. I sat there in my car, paralyzed by the weight of it all. The betrayal, so vivid and undeniable, played out in front of me like a grotesque opera. My breath came in shallow gasps, my fists clenching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. But instead of storming into the hotel, I stayed. Fury burned in my veins, but I forced myself to let it simmer. I didn't want a scene. No, this required something far more calculated. Something worthy of the pain she had caused me. If music had brought them together, then music would also destroy them. As they laughed and loved in the shadows of that dingy hotel, I sat in my car, planning my revenge. A symphony of ruin that neither of them would ever forget. I drove home in silence, the roar of my thoughts louder than any music I'd ever composed. I felt hollow, like my soul had been scooped out and replaced with something cold, sharp, and unrelenting. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, too. Gabriel, the man whose baton once dictated the rhythm of my work, had stolen the melody of my marriage. But I wasn't going to confront them in a burst of anger. No, that's what they'd expect. My revenge had to be precise, like the final movement of a symphony, where every note builds toward an inevitable crescendo. I would ruin them both, in their love and in their careers. First, I began to gather my tools. Revenge, like music, requires preparation. Started small. Over the next few days, I paid careful attention to Elena's behavior. She was careless, more than I'd expected. She didn't even notice me glancing over her shoulder as she typed passwords into her laptop. A quick mental snapshot and I had access to her emails. I waited until she was asleep one night and opened her account. It didn't take long to find their correspondence. The messages were filled with the kind of passion she used to reserve for me. She sent him drafts of her compositions, calling them their secret. Gabriel replied with phrases like, "Can't wait to rehearse with you again," and "Our private encore will be unforgettable." I copied everything. Screenshots, saved emails, even a few explicit photos she'd sent him. It was painful, but I read every word. The more I saw, the clearer my plan became. Music would be their downfall. Our orchestra had an upcoming gala performance. A grand event that would be broadcast live to an audience of thousands. Gabriel would be conducting, of course, and Elena had been selected to perform a solo piece. A piece she had written herself. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was supposed to have helped her refine it, but she had chosen Gabriel to share her creative process instead. That performance would be the stage for my revenge. Over the following weeks, I kept up appearances. I acted as though nothing was wrong, even as I worked tirelessly behind the scenes. I began tweaking Elena's solo piece, subtly altering the sheet music. It was a delicate balance. I couldn't change too much or she'd notice, but the adjustments I made ensured that the performance would fall apart. Wrong notes, impossible transitions, subtle dissonances. It would sound like amateur work at best and outright chaos at worst. But the music was just the beginning. I also prepared a special surprise for Gabriel. During the gala, I would have control of the screens that displayed live video and behind-the-scenes footage of the musicians. It took some bribery and a bit of technical expertise, but I ensured I would be able to upload a file, a montage of their emails, texts, and photos, to be played at the perfect moment. I wanted the world to see what they had done. Every betrayal deserves an audience. Elena continued her charade, oblivious to the storm I was orchestrating. She kissed me goodbye each morning, her lips brushing my cheek like the flutter of a ghost. Gabriel carried on as if nothing could touch him, his ego as inflated as ever. They thought they were untouchable, protected by the secrecy of their affair. But they'd forgotten one thing. I was the composer, the master of the symphony. And in this performance, they were merely the instruments I would play. The day of the gala approached, and I could feel the tension rising, the way the air hums before a storm. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. My hands were steady, my mind sharp. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. And soon they would know exactly how it felt to be destroyed. The day of the gala arrived, and with it came the electric buzz of anticipation. Musicians shuffled backstage, their instruments gleaming under the soft glow of the rehearsal lights. I walked among them, nodding and exchanging pleasantries, all while keeping my true purpose hidden beneath a veneer of calm professionalism. Elena was radiant, dressed in a flowing black gown that accentuated her grace. She smiled at me as she adjusted the sheet music on her piano, her eyes sparkling with excitement. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who whispered love songs to another man. Gabriel entered shortly after, exuding his usual arrogance. He was the picture of composure in his tailored tuxedo, nodding curtly to the musicians as he took his place at the conductor's stand. He barely glanced at me, as if I were beneath his notice. That suited me just fine. Tonight he wouldn't see me coming. The hall filled quickly, the murmur of the audience growing louder as they settled into their seats. The gala was a prestigious event, attended by critics, patrons, and even a few dignitaries. It was being streamed live, ensuring that every moment would be preserved for the world to see. As the orchestra tuned their instruments, I slipped away to the control room. The technician I'd bribed was waiting for me, a nervous look on his face. I handed him a USB drive containing the incriminating files, emails, texts, photos, everything. "When I give you the signal," I said, my voice low and steady, "play it, no hesitation." He nodded, swallowing hard. Back in the hall, the lights dimmed, and the audience quieted. Gabriel stepped forward, his arms raised in a commanding gesture. The musicians straightened, their instruments poised. The first piece began, a lively overture that filled the room with energy and light. I watched Elena as she played, her hands dancing over the keys of the grand piano. She looked at Gabriel more than at the music, her gaze lingering a second too long. She thought she was safe. They both did. As the orchestra moved through the program, my anticipation grew. Elena's solo was the centerpiece of the evening, and it was almost time. When the moment arrived, the stage lights dimmed, leaving her bathed in a single spotlight. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keys. The audience leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the first notes of her original composition. The piece began beautifully, the opening chords drawing a collective sigh from the crowd. But as she moved into the second passage, the subtle changes I'd made began to reveal themselves. Her fingers hesitated, stumbling over the unexpected intervals. A discordant note rang out, sharp and jarring. I saw her flinch, her composure faltering. The mistakes compounded, each one more glaring than the last. The audience began to murmur, confusion and disappointment rippling through the hall. Gabriel's face tightened as he tried to maintain control, his baton moving more erratically. Elena's hands trembled as she fought to salvage the performance, but it was too late. The piece collapsed into chaos, the once beautiful melody now an unrecognizable mess. The humiliation was palpable, radiating from her in waves. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the night wasn't over. As the final discordant note faded into silence, I gave the signal. The technician pressed a button, and the screens that lined the hall came to life. At first, the audience thought it was part of the performance, a visual accompaniment to the music. But as the images began to play, gasps of shock echoed through the room. There they were, Elena and Gabriel, their private emails, their intimate photos, their whispered promises of love. Everything was laid bare for the world to see. Elena froze at the piano, her face draining of color. Gabriel dropped his baton, his expression one of pure horror. The audience erupted into chaos. Shouts, gasps, and even laughter filling the air. I stood in the wings, watching the destruction unfold. They had played their part perfectly, and now it was time for the curtain to fall. This was only the beginning. The audience erupted into a cacophony of disbelief and outrage as the images played on the massive screens. Gasps turned to whispers, whispers to murmurs, and finally, a rising tide of accusations and judgment. Elena sat frozen at the piano, her hands trembling over the keys, unable to move or even meet anyone's gaze. Gabriel, meanwhile, stood at the podium, his face twisted in a grotesque mix of panic and fury. I watched from the wings, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me. This was my masterpiece, the revenge I had so carefully orchestrated. The betrayal that had eaten away at me for months was now their burden to bear, their humiliation on full display for all to see. Elena finally stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. This isn't, she stammered, but her voice was swallowed by the noise of the crowd. Gabriel shouted something at one of the stagehands, his face red with desperation, but it was no use. The images continued to play, each one more damning than the last. The emails were the worst. Their words, so full of passion and intimacy, cut through the air like a knife. "I've never felt this alive," one read. "You're the only one who understands me." Another, "When I'm with him, all I can think about is you." The audience didn't need to know the full context. The fragments were enough to destroy them. Gabriel tried to speak, his voice booming over the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, this is a misunderstanding. Someone is sabotaging." But no one was listening. The damage was done. Elena's eyes darted toward the wings, searching for me. She must have known. She must have seen the satisfaction in my face when I'd kissed her goodbye that evening, knowing full well what was about to unfold. But she didn't say anything. She didn't dare. Finally, the screens went dark, the silence that followed deafening. The audience sat stunned, a sea of shocked faces staring at the stage. Elena and Gabriel stood there, exposed and vulnerable, their careers and their reputations lying in tatters. As the murmurs grew louder again, Gabriel stormed off the stage, shoving past musicians and stagehands. Elena lingered for a moment, her eyes wide and brimming with tears, before she too fled, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. I stayed in the shadows, watching them retreat. The audience didn't care about their escape. They were too busy whispering, gossiping, recording every moment on their phones. By the time Elena and Gabriel realized what had happened, it would already be spreading online, the scandal snowballing out of their control. I should have felt triumphant. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To watch them suffer as I had? To see their betrayal laid bare for all to see. But as the orchestra began to pack up, their movements slow and uncertain, I felt hollow. The satisfaction I'd anticipated was fleeting, quickly replaced by an ache I couldn't ignore. I'd destroyed them, but I'd destroyed something in myself too. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the stage one last time. The piano sat in the spotlight, the seat empty. Elena's music sheets lay scattered on the floor, trampled and forgotten. The performance was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. I left the concert hall quietly, blending into the crowd of murmuring spectators as they exited, their voices tinged with shock and scandal. Whispers of Elena and Gabriel's betrayal followed me like a haunting echo, but I stayed silent, walking with my hands tucked into my coat pockets, my face unreadable. By the time I reached my car, I could already feel the cracks forming in the hollow satisfaction I had felt earlier. The crescendo of their humiliation had passed, leaving me alone in the quiet decrescendo of my own bitterness. But there was no going back now. What was done was done. I sat behind the wheel, the sound of my breathing filling the car. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a moment, I debated ignoring it. But curiosity won out. I pulled it out and saw Elena's name flashing on the screen. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. Not yet. The phone stopped ringing, only to buzz again a few seconds later. A text came through this time. I opened it reluctantly, expecting a plea for forgiveness. Instead, it was short and cold. You did this, didn't you? I let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the confines of the car. Of course, she knew. She always could read me better than anyone else, but not well enough to see this coming. I typed out a response, my fingers steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. You gave me the tools. I just played the notes. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. It buzzed again almost immediately, but I didn't bother to look. I didn't need to. She would try to justify herself, try to twist the story to make herself the victim. Instead of driving home, I went to a nearby bar. The place was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I ordered a whiskey, neat, and stared into the amber liquid as if it held the answers I needed. I replayed the night in my head, from the first note of her disastrous solo to the horrified expressions of the audience, as the truth spilled across the screens. The plan had worked flawlessly, yet I felt empty. The bartender broke my thoughts, setting another drink in front of me without me asking. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual. I smirked, shaking my head. "You could say that. Women?" he guessed. "Something like that." He chuckled knowingly and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The phone buzzed again, pulling my attention. I glanced at it, expecting another message from Elena. But this time it wasn't her. It was Gabriel. "You bastard. You're going to regret this." I stared at the message, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. So he was angry. Good. He deserved to be. But I didn't reply. He wasn't worth my words. Instead, I finished my drink, left a few bills on the counter, and walked back to my car. As I drove home, I thought about what Gabriel's message had implied. Regret? No, I didn't regret what I'd done. Not yet, anyway. But I knew this wasn't over. Not for them and not for me. The fallout of what I'd set into motion was only beginning, and I had a feeling that the next act of this symphony would be just as dramatic as the first. The house was dark when I arrived. Quiet, still, and empty, just like I wanted it to be. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle over me. The high from my act of revenge had worn off, leaving me raw and exposed. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and unyielding. I walked to the living room and poured myself another drink. Whiskey had become my companion tonight, the burn of it sharp enough to keep me grounded. As I sat down on the couch, my phone buzzed again, rattling against the wooden coffee table. I didn't pick it up right away. I stared at it, the soft glow of the screen casting long shadows in the dim room. Another message from Elena, no doubt. Or maybe Gabriel, still spewing his impotent threats. Finally, I reached for it, my curiosity outweighing my exhaustion. It was Elena. "We need to talk. Face to face. Come home." The irony of her words made me laugh out loud, the sound bitter and harsh in the empty room. Come home? As if this house still meant something to her. As if we still meant something. I typed out a response before I could overthink it. "I'm already home. You're the one who left." I hit send and tossed the phone aside, not caring if she replied. I drained my glass and poured another, the whiskey dulling the edges of my anger. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I let myself feel the full weight of her betrayal. It wasn't just the affair. It was the lies, the secrecy, the way she had taken something sacred and turned it into a weapon against me. The music. That's what hurt the most. I glanced at the piano in the corner of the room, its sleek black surface gleaming in the faint light. It had always been a symbol of our shared passion, our connection. Now it felt like a monument to her deceit. My phone buzzed again, dragging me back to reality. Another message from Elena, but this one was different. "You think this is over? It's not. I'll make you regret this." The threat hung in the air, her words dripping with venom. I felt my jaw tighten, my fingers curling into fists. Regret? No, I didn't regret what I'd done. But her defiance lit a spark in me, reigniting the flames of my anger. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even ashamed. She was angry that I'd exposed her, that I'd shattered the perfect illusion she'd built for herself. Good. Let her be angry. Let her feel even a fraction of what I'd felt when I discovered the truth. I stood and walked to the piano, my drink still in hand. The music sheets from her last composition were scattered across the top, and I stared at them for a long moment. I picked up the pages, flipping through them slowly. The notes that once held meaning now felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what they represented. Without thinking, I crumpled the sheets in my hand and tossed them into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the paper in seconds. I watched as the notes burned, the smoke curling upward like a ghost of what once was. This wasn't over. Elena was right about that. But if she thought she could turn this around on me, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As the fire crackled and the last remnants of her music turned to ash, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever came next, I would be ready. She wanted to play games? Fine. But she'd already lost. The next morning, the fallout from the gala had already begun to spread. News outlets, social media, even whispers in the local cafes, everyone was talking about the scandal. The orchestra's conductor and star pianist exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Their dirty laundry aired in front of an audience of critics and dignitaries. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the headlines. Their names were everywhere, tied together like a tragic duet. A Fair Rock Symphony Gala. Secrets exposed in shocking concert scandal. Photos of Elena and Gabriel flashed across my screen, their faces pale and drawn as they left the concert hall. But as satisfying as it was to see their humiliation, I knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Elena's message from the night before still lingered in my mind. You'll regret this. I didn't have to wait long to find out what she meant. By midday, my phone buzzed with a call from the orchestra's board director. I let it ring for a moment, taking a deep breath before answering. David, he said, his voice tight. We need to talk. I figured as much, I replied, keeping my tone calm. What the hell happened last night? He demanded. The orchestra's reputation is in shambles, and your name is coming up in every conversation. Elena and Gabriel are claiming you orchestrated the whole thing. I leaned back in my chair, suppressing a bitter laugh. They're not wrong. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Do you have any idea what you've done? This could ruin us. Donors are pulling out. Sponsors are asking questions. I did what I had to do. I interrupted, my voice steady. They betrayed me. They betrayed the music. I'm not going to apologize for exposing the truth. The director sighed heavily. Look, I understand you're angry, but this isn't just about you. The orchestra can't survive a scandal like this. We're already receiving pressure to distance ourselves from everyone involved, including you. There it was, the real reason for his call. I was being cut loose, thrown under the bus to save their precious reputation. So, you're letting me go? I asked, already knowing the answer. We don't have a choice, he said. You've put us in an impossible position. I didn't argue. What was the point? I'd seen this coming the moment I set my plan into motion. Sacrifices had to be made, and I was willing to pay the price. Fine, I said. Do what you need to do. I hung up before he could respond, tossing the phone onto the table. Losing my position with the orchestra stung, but it was a small price to pay for what I'd accomplished. Gabriel and Elena wouldn't escape this unscathed. Their reputations were just as damaged as mine, if not more so. And unlike me, they didn't have the truth on their side. Later that afternoon, Elena finally showed up at the house. I heard her car pull into the driveway, her hurried footsteps on the porch. She didn't bother knocking. The door swung open, and there she was, her face pale and her eyes blazing with fury. You, she spat, slamming the door behind her. You destroyed everything. I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. Everything? Or just the lies you built around yourself? Her hands balled into fists at her sides. You think this is over? Do you have any idea what you've done? Gabriel is threatening to sue, and You what? I interrupted, my voice cold. You'll tell everyone how you betrayed me? How you used our music, our life together, to carry on your affair. Go ahead, Elena. Tell the world. See how far that gets you. She flinched at my words, but her anger didn't waver. You're a monster, she said, her voice trembling. And you're a liar, I shot back. A liar and a cheat. Don't come here pretending you're the victim, Elena. You did this to yourself. Her face crumpled, the tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over. She looked at me, her expression a mix of rage and sorrow, before storming out of the house and slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the silence that followed, my chest heaving. The confrontation had left me drained, but I didn't regret a single word. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Days passed, but the fallout from the gala hadn't subsided. It only deepened. Gabriel had gone into full damage control mode, spinning the narrative to make himself the victim of a malicious act of sabotage. Elena followed suit, releasing a carefully worded statement about her deep regret over the incident, portraying herself as a woman caught in the crossfire of her husband's jealousy. I expected the lies. I knew they'd attempt to rewrite the story to suit their needs. But they underestimated me. I wasn't done yet, and their shallow attempts to salvage their reputations only fueled my resolve. The first sign of their retaliation came in the form of a letter, a formal notice from Gabriel's lawyer, delivered to my door. I sat at the dining table, reading through the allegations. Defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, sabotage of a professional performance. He was threatening legal action, demanding a public apology and financial damages. I laughed out loud, the absurdity of it hitting me like a slap. Gabriel, the man who had stolen my wife and betrayed my trust, was trying to paint himself as the injured party. The hypocrisy was almost comical. Instead of panicking, I called my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had handled plenty of high-profile cases. I handed her the letter, watching as she scanned it with a practiced eye. They don't have much of a case, she said, setting the papers down. But that doesn't mean they won't try to drag you through the mud. Let them, I said, my voice hard. I'm not backing down. She smirked. I thought you'd say that. While my lawyer prepared our defense, I turned my attention to Gabriel and Elena's careers. The orchestra had already suspended them both pending an internal investigation, but I wanted to make sure they wouldn't recover so easily. I began reaching out to the connections I'd built over the years, journalists, patrons, critics. I didn't share anything overtly defamatory. Instead, I let them connect the dots themselves. I leaked tidbits about the affair, the coded music, the betrayal that had unraveled during the gala. Within days, whispers turned into headlines, and their names were dragged even further through the mud. Elena tried to call me again, but I ignored her. She left voicemail after voicemail, her voice swinging wildly between anger and desperation. David, please, we need to talk. This has gone too far. You think ruining my career will make you feel better? You're destroying everything we built together. I loved you, damn it. I still do. Why are you doing this? Her words meant nothing to me now. Love? She didn't know the meaning of the word. If she had, she wouldn't have betrayed me so easily, so carelessly. Gabriel, on the other hand, stayed silent. No calls, no messages. Just the cold threat of legal action looming in the background. But I knew silence didn't mean surrender. He was plotting something just as I had been. We were locked in a game of revenge, each waiting for the other to strike next. One night, as I sat at the piano, I noticed something out of place. A photo frame on the mantel, a picture of Elena and me from happier times, was missing. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, a creeping sense of unease settling over me. Someone had been in the house. I checked the locks, the windows, but nothing seemed amiss. Still, the missing photo felt like a message. Gabriel's lawyer's letter hadn't shaken me, but this was different. It was personal, and it was just the beginning. The battle wasn't just professional anymore. It was becoming something darker, something more dangerous. I sat down at the piano, my hands trembling slightly as I placed them on the keys. Music had always been my refuge, my escape. But tonight, the notes felt heavy, burdened by the weight of everything that had happened. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a war, and I had no intention of losing. The missing photo wasn't the only thing. Over the next few days, I began noticing other small, unsettling signs. A window left slightly open that I was sure I had locked. Footprints in the garden near the back door. A faint smell of cologne, not mine, lingering near the living room. Gabriel wasn't just threatening legal action. He wanted to intimidate me, to rattle me, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead of panicking, I doubled down. I installed security cameras around the house, every angle covered. If he wanted to play games, I'd catch him in the act. I didn't tell anyone, not even my lawyer. This was personal now. Let him come closer. 2 nights later, the cameras caught him. At 3:14 a.m., Gabriel appeared in the grainy footage, creeping through the backyard, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of the security lights. He lingered near the kitchen window, his hand brushing the glass, before retreating into the shadows. I watched the footage the next morning, my jaw tightening with rage. He wasn't just a coward, he was reckless. Instead of calling the police, I saved the video. Gabriel had made his move, and now I had the proof to turn the game in my favor. He thought he could intimidate me. He had no idea what was coming. Gabriel's arrogance was his greatest weakness, and I planned to exploit it. I adjusted the security cameras to ensure clearer footage and left the kitchen window slightly ajar. A silent invitation for him to return. The bait was set. Elena's missing photo, now placed on the counter, in clear view from outside. A small note tucked beneath it read, "You think I'm scared of you?" That night, I waited in the dark, watching the live feed from the cameras. Sure enough, just past midnight, Gabriel appeared again. This time, he didn't just linger, he climbed through the window. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone, ready to make my next move. Gabriel moved cautiously, his steps almost silent as he crossed the kitchen. He spotted the photo on the counter, his hand reaching for it. That's when I stepped out from the shadows, a cold smile on my face. "Looking for something?" I asked, my voice slicing through the silence like a blade. He froze, his hand hovering over the photo. Then he turned, his face a mix of surprise and anger. "You've lost your mind," he spat. "No, Gabriel," I said, stepping closer. "I've finally found clarity." I held up my phone, showing him the live feed from the cameras. "Smile. You're on tape. Breaking and entering, trespassing. Should I keep going?" His face paled, but he recovered quickly, his arrogance bubbling to the surface. "You wouldn't dare. Try me?" I interrupted, my voice low and deadly. "You think you're untouchable? But I've already destroyed your reputation. Now I can take away your freedom, too." Gabriel stared at me, his bravado faltering. He knew he was cornered. Gabriel's chest heaved, his eyes darting to the open window as if calculating an escape. But he wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. "You think you've won," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "But this is just a game to you." "A game?" I stepped closer, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. "You trespassed into my home. You destroyed my marriage. You made this personal." He opened his mouth to retort, but I cut him off. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You'll leave the orchestra, publicly, announce your resignation and take the blame for everything. No excuses, no attempts to save face. If you don't, this footage goes straight to the police and the press." His face twisted with rage. "You can't force me to." "I can and I will," I said, leaning in. "Do you really want everyone to see the great Gabriel sneaking into his lover's husband's house like a common thief? Do you want to lose everything?" He stared at me, his confidence crumbling. Finally, he nodded, his jaw clenched. "Good," I said, stepping back. "Now get out." He hesitated for a moment, then turned and climbed back out the window, his retreat as pitiful as his threats. The trap had been sprung, and Gabriel was finished. The next morning, the headlines broke. Gabriel had resigned from the orchestra, citing personal and professional challenges. The statement was carefully worded, but it reeked of desperation. He was trying to save what little dignity he had left. Elena, too, was silent in the days that followed. No more calls, no more texts. I imagined she was piecing together what little remained of her shattered reputation. But I wasn't done. The footage of Gabriel breaking into my home wasn't for the public, but it was a trump card I kept in reserve. If either of them ever tried to retaliate, I would remind them just how vulnerable they truly were. As for me, I returned to my music. The piano, once a source of shared passion, now became a sanctuary where I could rebuild what they had tried to destroy. My compositions were darker now, more complex, reflecting the chaos I had endured. Revenge, I realized, wasn't as sweet as I'd hoped. It left a bitter taste, an emptiness that even their downfall couldn't fill. But it was necessary, a reckoning for their betrayal. The symphony of betrayal had ended, and I had played the final note.